It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan. David Feldman is having technical issues, so he won't be joining us today, but we do have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. And Ralph, this is our 400th program.
Yeah, 400 programs, many of them not replicated by any radio commercial or nonprofit or public broadcasting or NPR. Right.
You are correct, sir, and they're all archived at ralphnaderradiohour.com if you want to catch up on the 400. But this is kind of a landmark episode for us. And today, appropriately enough, we're going to talk about a subject that is most definitely in our wheelhouse, corporate crime. Our guest will be Mihailis Diamantis, law professor at the University of Iowa and the organizer of last month's Imagining a World Without Corporate Criminal Law Symposium. The symposium brought together top corporate crime scholars to explore what corporate punishment would look like if criminal liability was off the table. How would regulatory agencies and our civil legal system step in? What could replace criminal prosecution for punishing corporate offenders and pursuing justice for victims? Do we actually have a system of corporate criminal law in the U.S., or have we been duped? We'll ask Professor Diamantis about what he hopes to accomplish with the symposium and delve into his own contribution to the argument, which he co-authored with W. Robert Thomas, entitled, But We Haven't Got Corporate Criminal Law. Then we'll revisit another favorite subject, the post office. The U.S. Postal Service delivers almost half of the world's mail annually. They serve 160 million addresses. At nearly 250 years old, after a couple of facelifts, they're on time more than 90% of the time. Pretty good for a semi-quincentenarian. Don't worry, I did the math on that. Our second guest, historian Christopher Shaw, has written extensively about the vital role of the post office as a democratic public service. We'll ask him about his upcoming book, First Class, the U.S. Postal Service, Democracy, and the Corporate Threat. As always, we'll check in with our own resolute corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, if PG&E can set fires, Takata can blow up people's cars, and Nestle can use slave labor to harvest cocoa, does that mean arson, murder, and slavery aren't crimes anymore? Mihailis Diamantis is a professor of law at the University of Iowa, where he specializes in corporate crime and legal theory. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Professor Mihailis Diamantis.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Ralph. I'm grateful to be here.
Welcome indeed, Mihailis. We see you as a rising phoenix from the often moribund law schools when it comes to teaching corporate crime and researching it. We're in a corporate crime wave in this country and around the world. It's been that way for many years because the law has never caught up with corporate criminality. The recent exposures of financial crimes, the Panama Papers, the Pandora Papers, trillions of dollars being socked away, tax evasion around the world, major wealthy corporate interests involved. They set up hundreds of shell corporations. We have the Sackler-Opiad escape from corporate criminal law. Boeing has escaped for its killing 346 people with premeditated, risky software trying to substitute for an aerodynamic problem with the 737 MAXs. So here's my first question. Tesla has the combined stock valuation of the top 7 other auto companies, including GM and Volkswagen and Toyota. Elon Musk runs Tesla. He's put on the road these autopilots and these autonomous car experiments. There are not that many of them, but they've already killed or injured 12 people. He has known about this. He keeps putting the same autopilot with a little software alteration. He refuses to recall the cars. He's being investigated by the Department of Transportation. Those cars are now a risk to life and limb on the roadways. He won't recall them, as I noted. Is he a prospect for a manslaughter prosecution?
I think Elon Musk might be. I would first, though, probably focus on Tesla itself as a corporation. Part of what you're getting at here is, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, that our law of corporate liability is ancient. It's not been updated. It is literally ancient. It's this old doctrine called respondeat superior, which literally dates back to Roman times. It governed the liability that a slaveholder had for the torts and the misconduct of their slaves. And one of the things which I find particularly concerning about the artificial intelligence driving systems in the Tesla automobiles that are causing these accidents is that they don't fit neatly into this framework that we have for corporate liability. Since it was designed in ancient times, it requires a human being to engage in the misconduct for it to be attributable to the principal, in this case, the corporation. But what you see corporations doing a lot of times these days is when they have an algorithm, an artificial intelligence that ends up causing some kind of harm, you see the corporation saying it wasn't us, it was the algorithm. And since you don't have a person there, you have an algorithm rather than a human employee. These doctrines we have for corporate liability, they turn up short. We've seen prosecutors decline to pull cases, to pursue cases in circumstances where self-driving cars have run over people because they literally can't find the driver through whom to channel liability to the corporation. So given my interest in corporate criminal law, that'd be the first place that I would focus. I think it'd be a fact-intensive case to look at Elon Musk individually, but I could see a case developing there, particularly under some version maybe of responsible corporate officer doctrine, which allows in certain circumstances attribution of corporate misconduct or misconduct by subordinates within a corporation all the way up the hierarchy to the executive officers.
Well, let's turn to the Sackler family and the opiate epidemic. There's a huge public record on that. And the settlement allowed the Sackler family to avoid criminal prosecution. They had to pay $4 billion over time. They have 13 or so billion left. It raises the question, can you really have corporate criminal law enforcement unless you also have corporate criminal executive enforcement? In other words, not just the artificial entity of the corporation chartered by the state. Financiers don't create corporations. The state provides charters for these corporations, their birth certificate. Financiers fund them. But can you really have one without the other?
Well, as a matter of legal doctrine, you can't really have one without the other. In order to have a corporate prosecution, as I said, you got to find some individual criminal within the corporation. But just as a matter of common sense and good enforcement policy, you can't have effective corporate criminal regulation without pulling the 1-2 punch of both pursuing the corporation and any responsible identifiable individuals within the corporation. It's individuals that run corporations, you got to get at them. It's their interest that if you're going to be able to move them to move the corporation, that's the first fulcrum of influence that you have.
How do you analyze the Sackler prosecution and their corporation? Give us your view on that.
So I would say there's, again, probably a pretty good case against some individual Sacklers involved in the management of Purdue under the responsible corporate officer doctrine. Just one amendment to your opening about the description of the Purdue case. I don't believe as part of the bankruptcy settlement, the Sacklers got immunity from criminal prosecution. I think it was just from civil suits related to opioid distribution. So there's still some remote possibility that DOJ or some attorney general somewhere is going to pick up a case against individual Sacklers. So it's becoming increasingly remote possibility. One of the frustrating things about this case as well is that through the bankruptcy, as you know, the Purdue Pharma is now basically in public trust, or if the bankruptcy proceeds, is going to be in public trust, operated for the benefit of the victims. And there's no way that we're going to get a criminal case against Purdue Pharma either, given that it's now being operated for the benefit of the victims themselves. So this, to my mind, is one of the most egregious corporate violations in American history. And we are unlikely to see criminal prosecution of either individuals within Purdue, within the Sackler family, or of Purdue itself.
We're talking with Mihailis Diamantis, full professor of law at the University of Iowa. We're now in an era of no-fault corporate criminality. We're now in an era where corporate executives almost never go to jail. The crooks in Wall Street in 2008 were given a pass by Obama when he became president. Only a few years earlier, 800 executives in the savings and loan rackets were prosecuted and sent to jail. So the situation is getting worse and worse. I remember in 1970, I wrote a letter to President Richard Nixon urging him to have the Justice Department put out a report on corporate crime. In those days, the phrase corporate crime was never used. It was all white-collar crime, like a bank teller cheating the bank instead of the banks ripping off their customers Wells Fargo style in the hundreds of thousands of fake accounts that they established. I got no answer. In the subsequent years, we have failed to get any comprehensive congressional hearings on corporate crime. Once in a while, there'll be a bill introduced by Congressman John Conyers on endangerment, but it wouldn't go anywhere. Both parties would never talk about corporate crime, how it affects consumers, workers, the environment, communities, patients, children, you name it, in their campaigns. It's a taboo. And as I noticed, the immunity and impunity of corporate crime and corporate criminals running these corporations has only increased as the brilliant strategies and tactics of their corporate law firms become more and more embedded in the reality of the enforcement system at the federal and state level. So let me ask you this question. Before we get to the lack of any corporate criminal code to speak of, how many of these settlements, these non-prosecution agreements, deferred prosecution agreements, or not bringing any grand juries to the pursuit of these corporate crooks at all, are due to the total understaffing of the Justice Department, federal DAs around the country, state DAs around the country, and state attorney generals. One law firm, Baker and Botts, for example, has more lawyers than the entire number of lawyers working environmental crimes and antitrust crimes in the Justice Department. Just one Houston law firm of hundreds of that size. So how much of it is a deliberate budget squeezing by corporate lobbyists at the state and federal legislative levels to make sure there are very few federal cops on the corporate crime beat?
I wouldn't be able to put a number on the number of deferred prosecution and non-prosecution agreements that are attributable to lack of budget. And just for the listeners out there, a deferred prosecution or non-prosecution agreement is basically a kind of settlement that the DOJ, Department of Justice, will cut with a suspected corporate criminal to basically keep the corporate criminal out of trial, so they never have to plead guilty to a crime, and so they never have to face a jury or be convicted by a jury. And they can negotiate particular terms, whatever the DOJ wants to extract, some combination of fines or suggestions of compliance reform. I don't think the absolute number of deferred prosecution and non-prosecution agreements is really the number that we should be focusing on. Rather, it's the number of DPAs and NPAs that go to the largest corporate criminals. We have a fair number, still a piddling amount, but a relatively large number of prosecutions against small and mid-sized corporations engaged in localized crime. But it's really these biggest corporate criminals, the ones that we've been talking about on this show and that you talk about in previous interviews, that are getting the deferred prosecution and non-prosecution agreements. Now, there's several reasons for that. One, as you certainly point out, is budgetary restrictions. It takes a lot of money to investigate a corporation, and corporations are a lot of times willing to shell out money to outside law firms to conduct the investigation proactively themselves rather than have the DOJ come in and do it. And the DOJ, because of budget restrictions, is happy to defer that responsibility to the corporations. But I think in addition to budget squeezing, what we also have is we have a lack of expertise within the DOJ that I don't know if they know how to carry out an investigation like this, if most of the prosecutors in the DOJ would even know what to look for. So there's also a lack of expertise within the DOJ in terms of conducting these investigations. So that's another reason that I think they're happy to defer to outside law firms paid for by the corporation suspected of crime to basically do the investigation themselves and then put up in some polished memo to the DOJ an explanation, the corporation's story about what happened to lay the groundwork for negotiating one of these prosecution agreements.
Yeah, that's one of the scandals of so-called corporate crime enforcement. They let the law firms report back. They might be considered a little biased. Let's look at the role of these corporate law firms. They're all offices of the court. They're supposed to adhere to professional codes of conduct. Do you think that they engage more often than is generally reported in criminal enterprises, that they're actually in collusion? They actually devise the strategies, the arguments, the lobbying power for evasion of criminal laws, evasion of tax laws, evasion of environmental laws?
If we are talking about complicity of the law firms in their negotiation with the DOJ and the formulation of a responsive strategy on behalf of the corporation, I would be hesitant myself without strong data to impugn the professional integrity of the lawyers. I was one of them. I worked as a corporate defense attorney. It's how I got into this area of research in the first place. They have a professional responsibility, and I'm willing to give people the benefit of the doubt that they take it seriously. Now, as part of taking it seriously, there's obviously going to be a lot of cognitive bias. There's going to be a lot of sympathetic relationships that develop in the course of an investigation, compounded by the fact that these attorneys are hired and they have a professional obligation to zealously represent their clients, in these cases, the corporations that they are investigating. So part of what they're supposed to do is to formulate a sympathetic story about the misconduct that the DOJ suspects might have taken place. I do think it's problematic to outsource so much of this investigative responsibility to private law firms hired by and paid for by the corporations who are suspected of engaging in misconduct in the first place. So that'd be one of the first places that I would look.
Well, at law school, we're all taught that attorneys should zealously advance the interests of their clients. But I'm not asking the question on when the companies get in trouble, how do these corporate law firms try to defend them? I'm asking a more basic question, which is almost all of these corporate crimes globally and nationally and locally involve schemes that are drafted, conceived, sometimes brilliantly, by corporate law firms. The financial schemes behind all these reports that we read about in the press, payday loan rackets, there are schemes, there are contractual impositions on their victims, small print contracts. There are financial schemes in terms of monopolizing markets. You have schemes behind Google and Facebook and Pfizer and ExxonMobil. So we're not talking about defending when they're caught or when they're under investigation. What kind of responsibility do they have for these schemes? Because these schemes not only deal with tax avoidance or law avoidance, they deal with evasion. Outright criminal behavior is enabled by these schemes, including destroying documents. They have a fancy word for it in corporate law firms called document retention. Go ahead.
Yeah, I suspect, and I have a high level of confidence, that there are some attorneys who are engaged and complicit in their corporate clients' criminal misconduct. Again, without a good amount of data, I'd be hesitant to impugn the profession more generally. This might be a little Pollyannish of me, but my first place that I go to when I see a problem is not to blame individuals, but to look for perhaps systemic problems that are pushing individuals to behave in ways that are concerning to us. So what we have in white-collar criminal law generally is we have a very ambiguous and poorly drafted code. You look at false claims, you look at mail and wire fraud, you look at insider trading, you look at many of the statutes that corporations are routinely suspected of violating. What you see is a few words on a piece of paper, which courts have then expounded into a very complicated doctrine, which still has a lot of gaps in it. There's a fundamental problem of unclarity in our white-collar criminal law. And so there is a fuzzy boundary between what counts as sharp dealing and what counts as criminal misconduct. And it's a boundary that I think Congress needs to firm up. Now, as far as the attorneys are concerned, they have this ambiguous law that they're dealing with and trying to advise their clients about how to comply with it. And they themselves face a fuzzy boundary between zealous representation of their client in the face of an ambiguous law, giving them meaningful advice, and crossing over that line into something which borders on complicity in the corporation's misconduct. And it's hard to say because the line hasn't been defined for us yet. What's on what side and what's on the other. So I think we need more clarity there as well.
Well, we've just compiled 35 book titles documenting corporate criminality, very well footnoted. One just came out on the Sackler family, for example. There'll be ones on Boeing. There'll be ones on the oil industry, Wall Street. There already have been. I mean, there's plenty of existing documentation. And the manslaughter charges have been on the books for years. If you drive a car erratically because you're inebriated down a road and you kill a pedestrian, you can be prosecuted and go to jail. Corporations can refuse to recall cars with lethal defects, which result in death or injury, and they're almost never prosecuted. And I don't understand why some DAs do not use traditional manslaughter law. It's not first-degree murder. It's not second-degree. It's involuntary manslaughter against these corporations or corporate executives. What's the reluctance?
I think the reluctance is that, both against corporate executives and against the corporations themselves. I mean, you've pointed here to a clear law that we've had on the books. You kill someone with criminal negligence and you're on the hook for manslaughter. The problem here, I think, goes back to A, the antiquated doctrine we were talking about, and B, the standard of proof that prosecutors have to meet. So in order to prosecute an individual, prosecutor has to be able to show, or believe they'll be able to show beyond a reasonable doubt, that the elements of the crime were satisfied. And that turns out to be really difficult when you're engaging with a corporation, which is an information black box, right? If the corporation decides not to cooperate. And an information black box where anytime you pull open the lid, all you see is people pointing fingers at each other. It's very hard to reconstruct where the lines of responsibility are. And oftentimes what you'll see is that maybe there's no single individual responsible. You have kind of a diffused responsibility. And so maybe there's not any individual that is solely responsible for the catastrophe that resulted. Now, this has important implications for whether prosecutors can pursue these kinds of cases against corporations themselves, because under that antiquated rule, respondeat superior, let the master answer, the prosecutor has to be able to find some individual who satisfies the elements of the crime and then be able to, through them, attribute the crime to the corporation. But when you have these distributed types of crimes where each person is contributing maybe just a little bit to a catastrophic harm, you can't find that individual. There's a real case.
How about a solution? What if we had a law that required large corporations to appoint a compliance officer who's responsible for the conduct of the corporation? And so the prosecution can be focused on the compliance officer's negligence, indifference, corruption. So you pinpoint an office in a corporation and try to avoid the very real problem you pointed out, which is diffusion vertically and horizontally of responsibility for any particular decision, like building a Corvair or the 737 MAX. What's your view on the compliance officer approach?
So I think they have something similar to this, not necessarily a compliance officer, but in Japan, and I had a student who once told me from Guatemala, told me maybe in Guatemala as well, that there's the executive officer responsible for going to jail if the corporation commits a crime. And so you do have somebody, some token figurehead who can take the fall if the corporation does something bad. And so presumably they're going to be incentivized to really investigate and find out any problems. I'm not aware of this being an effective system of prevention, in part because there's nothing that one individual can do to manage a corporation that has hundreds of thousands of employees. I think that a lot of these problems are systemic rather than necessarily the responsibility of individuals. And I'd be hesitant to throw someone in jail when maybe even despite their best efforts, there are malicious employees through the corporate hierarchy who perhaps even subvert the compliance mechanisms that the individual put in place. What I think we need is...
To be sure, you have to have evidence of culpability, indifference, collusion on the part of the compliance officer. Let's go to another approach here. Do you think that we should revive the pulling of the corporate charter, throwing the company into a kind of environmental bankruptcy, creating a trustee, removing the rulers of the corporation, the officers, the board of directors? And there's precedent for that. In the late 19th century, the Standard Oil of Ohio got its charter pulled, and they didn't think it was that big a deal. You don't shut down the corporation, you just reconstitute it with a new governance. Do you see any opportunities there to pick some corporations and file at the state level for revocation of the charter?
Absolutely, absolutely. I would hesitate to say revocation and threatened dissolution, because I think that would exacerbate some of the problems we have already with prosecutors not wanting to bring cases against corporations for fear of driving them out of business. But in terms of perhaps even temporarily nationalizing certain egregious corporate criminals for the purposes of revising their governments and having some mandatory compliance review and reform directed by a government entity rather than by a law firm or private compliance company hired by the corporation itself, I do see a lot of promise there.
It's not putting them out of business, Mihailis.
Yeah.
It's putting the corporate crooks at the top out of business and reconstituting, reforming the structure with a trusteeship and then putting it on the straight and narrow path. Anyway, that's one approach. In one of your articles, you have a very seminal paragraph I want to read to our listeners. It's very short, but listen carefully and you'll see how important the insights are. This is a paragraph by Professor Mihailis Diamantis, full professor of law at the University of Iowa College of Law in Iowa City. Quote, criminal justice has four distinctive features. 1, utilizes uniquely demanding procedure. 2, to target the worst offenders with. 3, the harshest penalties. And 4, society's deepest moral condemnation. The United States purported system of corporate criminal justice lacks all four features. The biggest corporate criminals routinely sidestep all criminal procedure and any possibility of conviction by cutting deals with prosecutors, trading paltry fines, and empty promises of reform for government press releases praising their cooperation. The real question is not whether the United States should retain corporate criminal law, but what it would take for the United States to have a corporate criminal justice system in the first place, end quote. Now, I remember the government took Pfizer to court for promoting off-label uses of its drugs. Now, doctors can do it, but corporations who sell the drugs can't do it. And they settled for several hundred millions of dollars. And I remember people came to me and said, see, the system works. And I said to them, well, Pfizer probably made far more than that. And the fines, given the size of Pfizer and the volume of sales, is nothing more than a toll gate slap on the wrist. So wouldn't you say now, even at the highest levels of crackdown on corporate crooks, that what it really boils down to, nobody goes to jail, except maybe the janitor. Nobody goes to jail, and there's a toll gate by the Justice Department under pressure of corporate law firms and said, if you pay this much, you're clear. Isn't it really a toll gate system, a commercial dollar toll gate system, and in some instances, even deductible?
Couldn't agree more, Ralph. The fact is that corporate crime pays in the United States. The average fine for a corporate criminal resolution with the DOJ is just 0.04% of market capitalization. The DOJ gets to represent, when it publishes the press release about these deferred prosecution agreements, that, hey, we have extracted $100 million, maybe a couple $1 billion from one of these corporations. And it impresses people like the listener who came and said to you, hey, look, it works. But the fact of the matter is that these numbers, which seem astronomical to us individuals, are drops in the bucket when we're talking about these massive corporate behemoths, the ones who are most likely to A, engage in this type of criminal conduct, and B, the most likely to get some of these sweetheart deals from the DOJ. And so the conclusion that I take, if I was just a corporate exec without a moral compass, or if I could embody myself as a corporation without a moral compass, it is in my economic interest to engage in the type of conduct that Purdue engage in the type of conduct that you described Pfizer engaging in.
By way of exemplifying what you just said, the Justice Department under Trump actually convened a grand jury on the Boeing 737 MAX crashes. And it went on for months. Nobody knew what was being heard or ordered in terms of documents. It was pretty secret. And then suddenly on January 5th, 2021, just before Trump left office, the Justice Department announced a deal where Boeing admitted criminal conduct on behalf of two of its test pilots, but not Boeing executives, got wording saying Boeing executive culture is not attached to this criminal conduct. And they had a $250 million fine and about a $1.7 billion assignment of Boeing money to the airlines and $500 million for the families who lost their loved ones in the two crashes in Indonesia and Ethiopia. Now, that's $2.5 billion for a really massive corporate crime that has not finished its story yet. And in December 2018, at a board of directors meeting of Boeing, CEO Muhlenberg proposed a $20 billion stock buyback, one of many, and they approved it and later withdrew it after the Ethiopian crash. But here it is, just 1 year. Please, board of directors, rubber stamp, $20 billion in stock buybacks. Doesn't create any jobs, totally unproductive, usually done to improve the metrics of executive compensation. So that's what you're talking about. I mean, even when they do have a grand jury and they do come to a settlement, it's utterly trivial in terms of monetary bite. And also, a lot of what Boeing's paying for these disasters is insurable, deductible, and under the strange nature of corporate accounting, in some respects, depreciable. So we have to look at all the fundamentals, which is pulling the charter, establishing a real corporate criminal code that requires structural vulnerability inside the corporation so we don't get this diffused problem, gets rid of mens rea for corporations, and more basically establishes for large companies a new federal chartering so that state chartering out of Delaware or Reno is replaced for large companies by federal chartering, where you can bring up the birth certificate and the accountability, the constitution of the corporation is the charter, up to date. This was proposed by William Howard Taft over 100 years ago, Teddy Roosevelt over 100 years ago, and most recently, Senator Elizabeth Warren. What do you think of that?
Ralph, I think you're going in exactly the right direction. In fact, I would double down on the direction that you're going. I think that focusing on the fines in a settlement like the one that Boeing reached is, in some sense, a misdirection. The Boeing fine ended up being about 8% of its annual pre-crash revenues. That, if you were an average American with an average salary, that equates to about $4,100 for the 346 deaths that Boeing caused. It turns out that fines, beyond the legitimate use that they have of making sure that victims of the corporate misconduct are adequately compensated, it turns out they have very little impact on corporate behavior, not just because they're so small, but also because to have a fine big enough to move a corporation, you need a fine that would put the corporation out of business. The thing that really ticks me off about the Boeing settlement is not the small value of the fine, which itself is just expressively egregious, but is instead the fact that Boeing, a repeat offender who had entered into a settlement with the FAA just less than 3 years before its first 737 MAX crash over similar safety issues, got away from the DOJ without any oversight of the reforms that it promised to implement, reforms to its culture, which whistleblowers and investigations have revealed put profits over safety. Instead, all the Boeing got away with the DOJ was a promise to reform its compliance systems on its own, and then to submit annual reports to the Department of Justice, drafted by Boeing and the in-house attorneys that you were talking about earlier, to the DOJ. That's just a promise to do better in the future. Boeing already violated the trust implicit in its charter to conduct business in a lawful manner. I think what we need to do in the criminal justice system, corporate criminal justice system, is exactly the direction that you're pushing. Perhaps de-emphasize fines and emphasize instead mandatory government-directed reform, in the one mechanism of which might be the sorts of public trust that you were describing.
And that's what federal chartering can do. It could embrace a lot of the kind of proposals that you and others are advancing just to come up to date. I mean, these state chartering laws are ancient. They cannot address global corporate power skipping out of different jurisdictions, pitting jurisdictions against each other. And by the way, the deal that the Justice Department met on January 5th with Boeing didn't even require a corporate monitor.
Exactly.
They usually require corporate monitors to report from year to year to see whether the deferred prosecution agreement should be ended or no longer deferred with a renewed prosecution. Well, we're out of time, unfortunately. We've been speaking with Professor Mihailis Diamantis at the University of Iowa College of Law and a leader in the deliberative process about what are we going to do with these gigantic artificial entities called corporations who have been given by judicial decisions all the rights of human beings, but they have immunities and they have privileges and they have sheer capital power that no human being can ever attain, and raises the question as to whether there can ever be equal justice under the law with these giant corporations unmoored from Constitution, statutes, and international treaties. Thank you very much, Mihailis.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, Stephen. It was a pleasure.
We've been speaking with Mihailis Diamantis. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, why does Congress keep letting the dogs loose on the post office? But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, November 5, 2021. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The Federal Trade Commission is sending nearly $60 million to more than 140,000 Amazon drivers. The funds will serve as reimbursement for tips that Amazon allegedly illegally withheld from drivers between 2016 and 2019. In 2021, the FTC brought a lawsuit against Amazon and its subsidiary, Amazon Logistics, alleging that the company failed to fully pay tips that drivers in its Amazon Flex program had earned. Amazon Flex drivers deliver goods and groceries ordered through programs like Prime Now and Amazon Fresh. The complaint alleged that the company secretly kept drivers' tips over a 2.5-year period and only stopped the practice after becoming aware of the FTC's investigation. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with Ralph. Why does the Postmaster General keep trying to slow down the mail? Well, we're going to ask that question of our next guest. Christopher Shaw is an author, historian, and former project director at the Center for the Study of Responsive Law. His latest book is First Class, the U.S. Postal Service, Democracy, and the Corporate Threat. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Christopher Shaw.
Hello, glad to be back.
Thank you, Chris. I think a lot of people who have been watching the Postal Service in recent months have been wondering why the Democrats, who now have a majority on the Board of Governors of the U.S. Postal Service, have not tried to ease out Louis DeJoy, who was Trump's nominee and who had business dealings profiteering off the Postal Service, and who was accused by the very Democrats that now are not easing him out of trying to disrupt the collection and transmission of absentee ballots.
Well, first off, you raised a really good point, which is that the Postmaster General is no longer, and hasn't been for 50 years, directly appointed by the president. It is by the Board of Governors that has oversight of the U.S. Postal Service. And the thing is that that body was the one that selected Louis DeJoy, and it has affirmed its support of his policies. And they still hold a majority. Those first Board of Governor members who picked this guy in the first place still have a majority on the board. So practically speaking, he's there until they decide to get rid of him, until we have some more governors rotate off and some new people maybe come on. We get a different mix, a different perspective on DeJoy's tenure. But until that happens, he's still there. And DeJoy has been very combative in saying that he intends to remain in place and get used to him, and he'll be there for a long time. So he's not interested in leaving either.
Am I missing something? Clearly, DeJoy was Trump's nominee. He was a big supporter financially of Trump's campaign, and he was Trump's nominee, and it went over to the Board of Governors, which was controlled by Republicans, and they installed him as Postmaster General. But I thought there were 3 or 4 new nominees by Biden who have been confirmed by the Senate, and that was supposed to give the Board of Governors a majority in the hands of the Democrats.
Well, so right now there's 4 Republicans, there's 1 independent, and there's 4 Democrats. But in total, there's still the 6 governors that picked DeJoy in the first place, all 6 of them are still there. So even though you have the 3 new governors there, they still definitely hold a majority. Now there's 2 spots that are opening up in December, and there's a potential that Biden could pick 2 new members of the board, and they could come in and send the leadership in a different direction and pivot away from DeJoy. That could happen, but we'll have to wait and see what happens in December when those 2 spots open up. Otherwise, what could happen is the existing board would just go on and continue those expiring terms for an additional year.
Well, I stand corrected. How long is his term?
DeJoy can be in there as long as the governors want him to be. There's no specific expiration date.
What do you think of his October 1st decision to slow down first-class mail? Why would he think that it's more expensive to send letters from California airmail to the East Coast than it is to put them in trucks taking 3.5 days on the highway to get them to the East Coast?
DeJoy comes out of the trucking business. I think he's a big believer in the trucking business. And there have been, issues with air transportation, especially in the last year or so, with commercial flights being canceled and things like that. But what is happening here is this is a very short-term calculus. And the thing is, if you're a postal official, you have direct, immediate control over the expenses. So you can always cut those, and then it looks like your finances are getting better. So they tend to look at that side of the ledger more than the revenue side of the ledger. And how do we generate new revenues, where you have to be innovative and creative to do that, and you don't necessarily have complete control over what happens. So DeJoy has moved in the direction here of cost cutting, like so many postmaster generals before him. But what it means is that, for instance, if you're in the Northeast there, you used to get first-class mail. It would be 3 days coast to coast, anywhere in the country. Now, if you're mailing a letter from the Northeast, once you get west of the Mississippi River, it's going to be 4 days, also down in the deep South and in Florida. And then once you get to the Rocky Mountains and to the West Coast, it's 5 days. And it used to be that mail that now takes 5 days to get out to the Rockies and out to the Pacific coast, that used to be the time to get a letter out to Guam. So it's definitely a major slowdown, and it's especially impacting certain areas of the country, particularly the extremities of the country. Anytime you start reducing service, that's going to discourage people to use this agency. So I think there's definitely a potential for revenues actually to decrease because they're cutting service.
Well, the right-wing approach to destabilize and diminish the Postal Service and try to privatize more of it or corporatize more of it was you cut the service and you raise the postal rates, which is really not a very good business strategy if your interest is in expanding postal services, modernizing it, and doing what many of us, including you, Christopher Shaw, in supporting the reemergence of postal banking. Now, there's a flicker of light here on taking postal banking, which was operating for the first 60-some years of the 20th century, and then under commercial banking pressure, it was ended around 1967. But now, because there's over 30 million people who are unbanked or underbanked because they just can't afford the fees of banks, and banks don't think they're profitable enough to provide them with accounts, they would be natural customers of the reentry of the postal banking service at 33,000 post offices and branches all over the country. Tell us what's going on in that area.
We've had a significant breakthrough. It's the first major step, or really at this point, it's actually just a minor step, but it looks major because it's the first thing that's happened at all since the post office stopped accepting savings deposits back in 1966 when they got rid of the savings bank the post office used to operate. And so it's small. There's 4 post offices, one in the Bronx, one in Baltimore, one in Washington, D.C., and one in Falls Church, Virginia. And they are now open to cashing payroll checks and business checks. And so you can go into these post offices and you can cash those checks and you can get the money put on a debit card. And it's a single-use debit card. And then you can use that debit card at any location that would accept it. So this move into accepting, cashing checks is actually a major step. And there's definitely already resistance from existing check cashing outlets that charge very high fees, and also from the banking lobby has also voiced its complaints about this as well. And there's hope. The idea here is that going forward, this will be expanded. It will be expanded to new and greater things. So for one, the card could be made reloadable. It could be possible then if they put a no-fee ATM machine in the post office that you could use it to actually then draw out cash using the card inside the post office, and domestic money transfers from one post office to another, and also potentially bill payment services. These would all be under the legal purview, a lot of experts think, of the post office offering these without having major legislative change. So there's definitely first steps we've seen towards post office banking. And the interesting thing here is that it's happening under Louis DeJoy. Because if you look at his predecessor, Megan Brennan, the American Postal Workers Union, this has been a major priority for them for years. And they actually had in their collective bargaining agreement that she should explore this. Well, she did not do that. If you look at her predecessor, Patrick Donahoe, he flatly rejected the idea. And Ralph, if you remember, 15 years ago, when we spoke to John Potter, who was Postmaster General then, he never followed up on the idea either. So it's actually Louis DeJoy where we're seeing the first step towards anything like reviving the bank at the post office again.
You know, I circle in Congress, and a lot of people in Congress don't really use the Postal Service, the staff. You see in the garages trucks from UPS, trucks from FedEx. They don't even prefer U.S. Postal Service trucks. Tell our listeners why you think the Postal Service or the old U.S. Post Office is so critical in the future. I mean, in the past, they bound the country together. They were known for reliability. You could send a letter 3,000 miles or 30 miles, and it's the same postage stamp in terms of cost. They even delivered eggs overnight. People would put a letter in the morning in their town, and the person received it in the afternoon. And now you have far fewer post boxes on city streets. You have far fewer postal workers. But tell us how relevant, especially in the era of emergency and rural areas, the Postal Service still is.
Well, I think that history that you're describing, that history of being an agency that binds the nation together, that history of providing universal service to everybody on a democratic basis, which is an affirmation of democratic ideals in this nation, I think that's still very relevant today, and it can be something that we should see going forward, that the Postal Service continues to promote. And specifically, if we look at democracy, the post office, from the very beginning, the idea is it's going to transport communications, so we're going to have better educated citizens in this new experiment in Republican government, distributing newspapers at a lower cost. People are better informed. Well, they still do that today, but there's no reason why we can't have, we're still doing this, but we should be looking towards perhaps having the post office offer email accounts, perhaps having a postal search engine. There's no reason that can't transition to electronic services. That same idea of a well-informed citizenry and the post office as a agency of government that helps that to happen. Also, the fact is that there are lots of people who are postal dependent. They do not have access to broadband internet, for instance. And the Postal Service is the one universal communications system that is accessible to everybody. And so the Postal Service provides service in rural areas where a for-profit business never would go because the profit just wouldn't be there. And so if you took away the Postal Service, these places would be left out of communications. These individuals would not be able to participate and communicate with others. So these are things the post office is doing now. It needs to continue to do it. And also the financial services we were just talking about, this banking, with all these people who are being left out, 8 million unbanked households without any bank account who have to pay very high fees just to do basic things like cash a check. These are people too the post office can serve. So the post office has a great tradition of helping democracy, of serving everyone in an equal manner, of disseminating information and news. And these things are all just as important in the 21st century. So I think it's important to have a reimagining and an updating and an expansion of what the Postal Service is.
And that's what your new book is all about. Your new book is First Class, published by City Lights in San Francisco, a progressive publisher. We're very proud to be a part of your long-term effort, having worked with you on a prior report on the Postal Service. You have a PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley, and I think that more radio stations should interview you at the local level. And there is a group in Washington that's coordinating this. Just contact area code 202-421-6858. That's 202-421-6858. And they can arrange an interview with Christopher Shaw on all these matters. Just by way of proportion, Chris, The Democrats and Republicans in the House committee recently added $20 billion to the military budget, $20 billion more than President Biden asked the Congress to give, $20 billion. Give an example of the size of the Postal Service, what's its revenues, and what $20 billion would do to the Postal Service upgrade and expansion.
The Postal Service's annual revenues are around 70 billion, 80 billion. I mean, it's a lot of variance that's been going on because of COVID and how that has changed everything in terms of how the society is operating. It's had a lot of financial problems. It has everything to do with this mandate to pre-fund its retirees' health benefits 75 years into the future at the tune of $5.5 billion over 10 years that no other government agency attempts to do, no other private corporation attempts to do. So that's really responsible for maybe as much as 90% of the Postal Service's financial losses. But if you're constantly operating under financial pressure, if you're constantly operating under these thin margins, then you don't invest in your infrastructure and it begins to deteriorate. And you especially see this with the postal trucks. So they're trying to replace those now, but you have trucks on the road that are 30 years old still. You have a whole network of post offices, and then you have all these ideas that could be pursued that have not been pursued. $20 billion could go a long way in all kinds of directions here. I mean, one thing just to point out is the Postal Service has never been able to have its own airline. It's dependent on commercial passenger airlines. It's dependent actually on its competitors, FedEx and UPS, to move anything by air. There's no reason the Postal Service shouldn't have its own airline, just like FedEx and UPS have. So $20 billion could go a long way, especially for an agency that's been starved for resources for a long time now.
And distribution of medical supplies in an emergency, for example. You got 33,000 outlets. That far is greater than Walmart's or McDonald's number of stores. These are gathering places in smaller towns in an impersonal internet age. You actually can mix it up with friends and neighbors you meet at the post office. There are intangibles here. Post delivery people going through residential areas, they've often saved lives. They talk with people, and it's a different quality of life that we should not forsake, to put it mildly. I would like to end with this, Chris. How do you describe the mainstream media's reporting and public radio and public broadcasting? Have you been interviewed by any national media? This is your second book on the Postal Service.
I'll just say that I think that media coverage has gotten better since 2020, because in 2020, you had a lot of people who never used the Postal Service very much. I mean, there are some people in this country who tend to be wealthier, tend to live in cities, and they are not nearly as dependent on it as people who are lower income, who are older, and who are more rural. But in 2020, all of a sudden, they see the fact that, hey, I have to vote during a pandemic. We have a national election happening during a pandemic. Well, thank goodness that we have a national infrastructure here that is prepared and ready to step into the breach and allow this national election to continue. I mean, the presidential election of 2020, just the fact it could even happen logistically, was not guaranteed. But the Postal Service was there, and it stepped in, and it got the job done. And we should be very thankful for that. And so I do think that there is more interest in reporting now on the issue than there was. But at the same time, for an agency that touches all of our lives 6 days a week, that has post offices in over 30,000 different communities in this country, and that is the third largest employer, there ought to be more interest, you would think, than there is.
Well, the people rallied to the post office last year, surprising some of the Washington media, not to mention members of Congress. They were taken aback by sort of almost a patriotic rally of people all over the country, regardless of their political backgrounds. Well, years ago, we thought one solution to preserve, protect, and expand the Postal Service was something we called POCAG. Can you describe that briefly?
POCAG is a great idea, the Post Office Consumer Action Group. It's your idea, Ralph, and we can all be thankful for that idea. But essentially, it's a voluntary nonprofit organization. The post office would deliver a letter or a postcard 4 times a year to all the residential addresses, and it would give people the opportunity to pay a small membership due in order to join the organization. And then that money could be used to hire a staff that would be an advocate for the public, an advocate for the American people, in ensuring that they receive adequate and, frankly, a first-class postal service like they deserve. So you'd, instead of just having the lobbyists for UPS and FedEx and the major mailers and these other groups here that are oftentimes talking about cutting service, closing post offices, are not interested in certainly improving services, you would have an advocate and a lobbying group for the average American citizen. So POCAG would really do a lot and go a long way towards giving citizens a voice in the management of their postal service, which is our people's post office.
And less than 1% of the people who join POCAG around the country can make this a formidable force, both locally, regionally, and nationally. And to read more about it, you should get Christopher Shaw's new book, First Class, and talk it up. Talk it up. Get it for your local library. Give it to your local postmaster. We're ordering a lot of Chris's books to give to various postmasters so they can educate the community and assure them of the critical importance of the Postal Service, even in this automated, computerized internet age. Is there any last thing you want to tell us, Chris?
I just want to say that the Postal Service it's part of our Commonwealth. We all own it. It's our agency, and we can make it what we want it to be. At one time, it did not offer banking. Grassroots lobbying got it to offer banking. At one time, the Postal Office did not actually deliver packages, but there was a monopoly that was price gouging. People demanded and got it to do that. So it is there for our use, and we can make it into public service that we can all be proud of, and we can think well beyond letters and envelopes in terms of what this means to us as a nation.
And the we ends up on Capitol Hill, Congress, so they can stop succumbing to the commercial mailers and other corporations and free the Postal Service to meet its great potential in the coming decades. Your member of Congress, once again, listeners. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you. Good talking to you.
We've been speaking with Christopher Shaw. We will link to First Class, the U.S. Postal Service, Democracy, and the Corporate Threat at RalphNaderRadioHour.com. I want to thank our guests again, Mihailis Diamantis and Christopher Shaw. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. For a copy of The Day the Rats Vetoed Congress, go to ratsreformcongress.org. And also check out the Ralph Nader and Family Cookbook, Classic Recipes from Lebanon and Beyond. We will link to both of those on ralphnaderradiohour.com. And join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we welcome musician and activist Tom Morello. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. I hope this program will help some of our Congress Club members in sending the corporate crime letter to their senators and representatives and demanding specific replies. It was a good education, I think.
Hi, this is Jimmy Liebert, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the Wrap-Up, where we continue our conversation with Professor Mihailis Diamantis.
Let's see if we can ask you a series of quick questions that will lead to action. Number one, do you think that a few dozen of law professors, things start with ideas, can organize a loose association of corporate crime studies professors and start getting state and federal legislative hearings?
I'm not a political organizer, but I am an optimist, so I do think so. I think we'd have trouble getting a few dozen law professors who are actually knowledgeable about these issues. I'd put it more on the area of 2 dozen, maybe up to 30. But I do think you get enough people sounding alarms and you can get some movement.
Okay, the other thing is trying to get more corporate crime courses in the law schools. There are a few dozen law schools that have a course by that name, but most of them do not, and they're not required courses. They're usually seminars. Can you give us a quick review of the scene there?
Yeah, so I don't think there's enough white-collar crime taught. I don't think there's enough corporate crime taught. I do think it's an important contrast to street crime, which is usually what's taught in the 1L curriculum, because you leave that 1L course with first-year law course with certain assumptions about the criminal justice system, and they don't translate at all to the white-collar criminal justice system, which, just as a matter of numbers, has a much more profound economic impact on the nation. By FBI estimates, something on the order of 20 times, conservatively estimated, 20 times the economic impact of individual street crime. So I do think that there is a large gap there. I don't think it's taught enough. And I'll just issue an open call to any law professor, criminal law professor interested in teaching this course. Happy to share my materials, happy to share my syllabus. I know startup costs are pretty high for prepping a new course, and mine are available to you. Just reach out.
What about the American Bar Association? They have all kinds of specialized sections on admiralty and commercial law. They don't have one on corporate crime. Is that worth pushing?
I think it absolutely is. This is where law professors and other policymakers who are concerned about an issue can have a voice that actually carries some gravitas rather than, me. I put my papers up on SSRN. I publish them in periodicals, but who knows who reads them. I think this is a place you have a professional organization. You can carry the weight of that organization behind it if you put it out. So I'd be in support of that.
In our interview with Professor Coffey, who's written a book recently on corporate crime, teaches at Columbia University, and I urged him to draft a federal corporate criminal code worthy of the name, because the existing federal corporate criminal code is an absurdity, as you have pointed out. It's antiquated, it's weak, it's incomplete, and it's coarsely not even enforced, except in very few circumstances. And the enforcement always ends up in a negotiated deal, like a non-prosecution agreement or deferred prosecution agreement. Now, here's where the professors you just mentioned could get together and actually draft a proposed federal and state corporate criminal code to bring it up to Silicon Valley and artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, biotechnology levels, as well as more traditional areas of industry and commerce. And this is important because if you go up to Capitol Hill, there's no capacity there. They are very overwhelmed, understaffed, thanks to the Gingrich reforms, which the Democrats furthered, and they wouldn't know where to begin. And the Library of Congress advises they don't really have much specialty. So I think the key way to get this whole effort moving so we can have these corporations and these corporate officials under some semblance of the rule of law is to draft the actual statutes. Do you see that initiative on your horizon?
I'd be very interested in that. I know there's a lot of hunger among other corporate crime scholars for carrying out a project like that. There is no general statute of corporate fault. All we have is this doctrine that I mentioned a few times, respondeat superior, that was introduced to the criminal law by the Supreme Court. It's a common law doctrine incorporated into federal law. We don't have a general statute of corporate fault. So I think without too much work, you can put something together. I think there's a developing consensus about what corporate fault looks like. It's very different from the current law that courts are enforcing. And I think it'd be something that could strengthen the hand of prosecutors who are courageous enough and willing to go after corporations that truly are at fault. So I think there'd be a lot of interest in that. Yeah.
So once you have it, people can rally around it. It has a bill number in the House and Senate. Hearings can be pressed for. The press starts getting interested in it. As of now, it's pretty amorphous. Steve, do you have any comments or questions? We've been talking with Professor Mihailis Diamantis, who is a professor of law at the University of Iowa City, Iowa, and who was the lead sponsor of a symposium recently at the Georgetown University School of Law with a provocative title, Imagine a World Without Corporate Criminal Law. And he had scholars on both sides from the country and around the world. Steve, how does it strike you as a Yale graduate, an impresario, a television script writer par excellence?
Well, Ralph,
are we getting too much in the weeds?
Well, not too much, but as long as you frame the question that way, I am a professional storyteller, and it's very fascinating when you were talking about the stories being farmed out, basically investigating yourselves, a corporation being able to investigate itself, farming it out to a law firm. That would be like somebody being arrested for a crime and, you farming out the trial to the defense attorney. So the importance of storytelling is paramount here. Who is telling the story? So if the defense is telling the story, it's going to be one thing. If we've been telling a story, it's going to be another. That's my comment as the impresario. The thing I want to know, just from a personal point of view, Mihailis, is you said you started as a corporate defense attorney. What turned you? What brought you to the other side of this?
I have a background in philosophy. I have a PhD in philosophy, Stephen, and it was in the course of talking to a colleague when I was an attorney about the doctrines of corporate fault that we have in our criminal justice system that really struck me as a live theoretical inquiry. What does it mean for a corporation to have fault? And as I started looking into that, I saw the complete disconnect between this ancient law that we have on the books in the United States and any reasonable, whether you're talking reasonable in terms of philosophical theory, which is not going to move many people, or in terms of compliance science and organizational science, or you're just talking in terms of people's basic intuitions about right and wrong in an organizational setting, the current law just totally disconnected from all of that. And then as I dug in more, started to see a lot of the really troubling trends, not just trends, but almost the informal law on the books of corporate criminal enforcement, which is just really, really outrageous. Now, I think that I hesitate to say of myself that I am on the other side. I don't like talking about sides. As I've mentioned before, I think when I see a problem, my first inclination is to look to the system rather than to the individuals. And what I see in our corporate criminal justice system is a broken system. I think even if individuals wanted to do better, it would be hard for them, given the current legal landscape, where we don't have a meaningful doctrine of corporate fault. We have ambiguous white-collar statutes. We have prosecutors who are torn between Scylla and Charybdis, between perhaps, even if they're well-intentioned, wanting to prosecute big corporate crime and the concern over the potential economic fallout of bringing a corporation to trial and securing a conviction if some of the automatic collateral consequences that we haven't really discussed yet, but which would kick in on a corporate conviction for many corporations that would automatically drive them out of business. I think we just have caught ourselves up in Chinese finger trap and a catch-22, whatever you want to call it, and we need to extract ourselves by talking about some meaningful reforms, stepping back, doing the kind of thing that you were just talking about doing, Stephen, where you say, look, let's step back and let's think about the narrative that we are painting here with respect to criminal enforcement and corporate misconduct. And one compelling way to retell that story is, as you just, Stephen, to think about it in terms of what would it be for an individual to do this? It would be absurd, as you point out, to ask an individual to investigate on behalf of the DOJ their own allegations of corporate misconduct. It doesn't make any more sense to have corporations doing it. And so, for example, that might be one place to start in terms of talking about reform. Having a DOJ or perhaps even a separate agency which is responsible, has the expertise and has the resources, perhaps self-funded by the fines that it would collect, but whose sole responsibility is to investigate and prosecute major corporate crime.
In conclusion, let me ask you a really far-out question, Mihailis. The trajectory of corporate immunity has many strategies, but one of them is to keep escaping from jurisdictions. You escape from local jurisdiction to a state, then you escape from a tough state to the national, then you escape from the national to the international, where the range and grasp of the rule of law becomes weaker and more ambiguous and harder to detect. Now, the corporations are taking millions and millions of Americans into virtual reality, which again puts them under terms and conditions that are extremely one-sided when they click on. And virtual reality, as many observers are pointing out, is at the outer range of traditional legal embraces. Now Zuckerberg wants to take billions of people into what he calls the metaverse, which is even more remote from existing legal frameworks. Give me your observations on that. Any research going on there?
I'm not aware of anybody who's researching crime or the possibility of crime in the metaverse. I think you're pointing to a really troubling trend, which is that we have these antiquated doctrines of corporate liability that are only going to become increasingly antiquated as we enter a new stage of economic development, which is more reliant on artificial intelligence, and a new stage of perhaps social development, which might be reliant on something like the metaverse or VR. Personally, I hope we never get there, but maybe we're headed in that direction. And unless our doctrines are robust enough and general enough to transition to the next mode of economic and social development, they're just going to be the gap between corporate justice and what we see in reality is only going to widen. I'll just flag one other thing that terrifies me about the metaverse, just because it's a pet interest of mine, but also our antiquated privacy laws, which I am really concerned will become obsolete as we move to something like the metaverse. As we all spend more and more time online, they are already obsolete. And I just think that's another space where individuals are going to be victimized by corporations in ways that personally I think are criminal, but the DOJ hasn't yet shown much interest in criminally prosecuting privacy violations.
Yeah, we ought to use the word criminogenic more. That is not technically violating a criminal statute, but violating common law principles hundreds of years ago of criminal behavior. Criminogenic is a good word, I think, to use. But as Stephen Hawking and others pointed out in a seminal public letter to the world a few years ago, artificial intelligence is the essence of escaping not just human control, like autonomous weapons, etc., but also entirely escaping the rule of law. And that's part of the metaverse that Zuckerberg is developing an architecture for without any consideration of consequences. The guy just looks at sales of these goggles and augmented reality. In a way, there are these very rich people in Silicon Valley who know how to make huge amounts of money. But in other areas of human, social, legal, political, psychological behavior, they're idiots. They're like idiot savants. It's like the brilliant chess player who doesn't know anything about anything else. But they are a danger to the rule of law. They're a danger to the security and prosperity and individuality and cooperation of people of the world. And the law is just not keeping up. And that ought to be a major symposium in law schools all over the country. We need corporate crime materials in the libraries. We need corporate crime courses at 1L and 2L, developed in more detail in the third year. We need to encourage the third-year students to write senior theses. We need to have more symposiums the way you had at Georgetown. So you really got your future laid out for you, don't you, Mihailis?
I sure hope so. And I think we need to, as you point out, think creatively and proactively about the problems that VR and technology are going to be raising. Not only the challenges, but also the opportunities that VR and artificial intelligence raise, because to some extent, these can be utilized by motivated enforcement agencies to track corporate misconduct. Artificial intelligence can be a tool for enforcement. It can analyze stock trades to find insider trading. It can also be a tool to facilitate insider trading and stock manipulation. So we want to get ahead of it and find out what the potential problems are and also what the opportunities are. So I sure hope to stay in this space for very long.
Yeah, the supreme genius of law at its idealistic level is to be able to foresee and forestall the future. And so that's what I gather you're mentioning as well.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week when we welcome Rage Against the Machine's Tom Morello. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting way